Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This week, we're talking about the philosophy of race and the philosophy of gender. So, last week, we investigated the problem of personal identity, which has to do with what makes you the same person over time. But investigating personal identity did not tell us anything about who we are, right? What makes us who we are? Two important components of that, some people argue, has to do with race and gender. Why? Because these are two things that the world ascribes to us, right? These are ways in which the world identifies us. So, as far as other people are concerned, they make up a great deal of who we are. And perhaps, for us as well, internally, they do a great deal of work. So, it's going to be important then for us to understand what exactly these things are. What is race? What is gender? We're going to look at a couple of articles today that try to give us some kind of insight where those two questions are concerned. So first, we're going to begin with Charles Mills. We're reading the introductory chapter to a larger book of his called But What Are You Really? Right? Okay, so jumping right in then, Mills draws this distinction between race and what he's calling a quace, right? This is just a made-up thing. So he asks us to imagine this world where people are born and they're assigned a quace more or less arbitrarily. There could be some kind of system, but it doesn't reflect any real division. So this would be something like the way you are assigned a social security number, right? There might be a system by which you're assigned the number, but it doesn't really say anything about who you are. It's more or less an arbitrary assignment. Quace is supposed to function like that. There's no kind of social dynamic tied to your quace, right? There is no prohibition against intermarriage. There's no disparity in social power. There's really no kind of hierarchy at all where quace is concerned. In a world like that, Mill says, if someone were to ask you what your quace was, the question is relatively benign. Right? The question doesn't really mean much where your identity is concerned. It'd be like reporting your driver's license number, right? It doesn't really tell me anything about who you are. So if someone were to ask you the further question after you answered them, okay, but what are you really? It seems like the question would make no sense at all, right? There is nothing significant about quace. There is no metaphysical ring to it, right? When you say that you're one quace versus another, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of metaphysical or historical resonance to that. Okay, that's not how our world works, right? The point of this quace notion is to contrast it with the way race functions in our world. In our world, race is used to impose some kind of hierarchy. Right? Race is used to facilitate forms of discrimination. It does not function like quace. The important distinction, Mills argues, is between a horizontal social system and a vertical one. So in a horizontal social system, your categories, your quaces in this case, exist horizontally. There is no hierarchy. But in a vertical system, obviously, that's not going to be the case. Some categories are going to be higher than others in the hierarchy. Okay. So in a good vertical system then, and by this, Mills does not mean morally good, just in a good in a sense that it is well functioning, right? In a well functioning vertical system, there should be pretty clear rules as to who fits in what category. If you're going to say that some people ought to be higher in the hierarchy because of who they are, you ought to have good rules for determining, well, who is where, right? So our society functions like a vertical society because, well, race is leading to things like discrimination coming out of an imposed hierarchy, right? But it's functioning imperfectly. It's because we don't have definite rules for deciding, well, who goes where. This is going to be a problem, right? Here's Mills. Nonetheless, the system has been sufficiently successful that, to take the United States as an example, more than 200 years after its founding, people still think of themselves as raced. American cities are more segregated now than they were at the turn of the century. There's little intermarriage. Blacks are still, by conventional economic measures, near the bottom of the ladder. And some leading Black intellectuals are now speaking despairingly of the permanence of racism. So even if race turns out to be some kind of arbitrarily assigned phenomena like quace, right? If it's some kind of arbitrarily assigned category, we can't think of it like quace because it has been used successfully enough that there does exist something like a hierarchy in our minds, right? At the very least, it is in some sense real. Okay, but how is race real? That's the bigger question, right? We need to start doing the metaphysics of race. Okay, so when we're doing metaphysics here, we're talking about doing social metaphysics. Social metaphysics is just exploring that which makes our social world what it is. For example, the notion of social class, there's a lot of work on that, right? When it comes to explaining why our world is what it is. So Mills is just suggesting that race would be one of these kind of social categories. Quote, systematic racial privilege has been an undeniable, though often denied, fact in our recent global history, and exploring an ontology of race will contribute to, though not exhaust, our understanding of social dynamics. Further, race is correlated strongly with civic standing, culture, citizenship, privilege, or subordination, and even designations of personhood. One's racial category has been taken as saying a great deal about what and who one is, more fundamentally. To what extent and in what ways, then, is race real, and how deep is this reality? Okay, so in other words, it's clear that race has played a large role socially. It's played a large role in our social world. So it is real in some sense. It is socially real. But in what ways is it real? How deep does the reality go? Well, there's a variety of positions here. Mills breaks them down into the following categories: realism, constructivism, subjectivism, relativism, and error theory. So let's look at them one by one now. Realism is just the idea that race is actually based in the world. That is, in some way, an objective matter of fact. There are natural races that people belong to or don't. Right? The realist about race thinks that race is something more than skin deep. It means something to belong to one race or another. That's why, Mills suggests, most people who are realist about race are also historically racist. Right? Okay, so clearly Mills thinks that realism about race is going to be false. Why? Well, one, it seems to run against current anthropological and biological understanding. Two, racial categories seem to be trans-world relative. Okay, so we're going to need to unpack that. To be trans-world relative, or to understand what that means, you need to understand that philosophers, when they talk about possibility, they often talk about possible worlds, right? So possible worlds are just different ways things could have been. We are here in the actual world, and then there are worlds that exist where there are only minute changes. Like little things have changed. It's a different possible world, right? The more robust a feature is, the more real a feature is, the more likely it is that that feature can be found in all those other possible worlds. If it's a necessary feature, it will exist in all possible worlds. Okay, so if race has some foundation in nature, then we should expect to find it in all of these possible worlds. But Mill says that would be a mistake, right? What seems to be the case is that the way our racial categories have been made could have been made otherwise. They don't have to be the way they are. There are different possibilities. If that's true, then it's not the case that race is trans-world relative. In other words, it's not the case that our racial categories are necessary. They could have been different. Okay. So if our racial categories could have been different, that means that the case for realism about race is not very strong. Right? You can't say that race is somehow real and baked into the world and also say at the same time, but in a world just like ours, the categories could have been made differently. Those two things don't work. Right? Okay. He does, however, think that race is in some sense real. It is in some sense real. So realism is false, but it would be a mistake to think that there is no component of race that is real. This leads him to racial constructivism. So racial constructivism is this idea that racial categories are defined intersubjectively. Intersubjective just means that we all agree, or many people agree. So the reality of race then, for the racial constructivist, just comes out of that agreement. Race isn't real because the world makes it real. Race is real because, well, everyone treats it like it's real, right? So it gains this sense of reality, this sense of realness from intersubjective agreement. Here's Mills. An objective ontological status is involved, which arises out of intersubjectivity, and which, though it is not naturally based, is real for all that. Race is not foundational. In different systems, race could have been constructed differently, or indeed never have come into existence in the first place. Race is not essentialist. The same individuals would be differently raced in different systems. Race is not metaphysical in the deep sense of being eternal, unchanging, necessary, part of the basic furniture of the universe, but race is a contingently deep reality that structures our particular social universe. Having a social objectivity and causal significance that arises out of our particular history. Thus, intersubjectivity creates a certain kind of objectivity. Race is real for us. Why? Because it has massive effects on the world we live in. It's because we, intersubjectively, have made it the case that it's real, right? Its realness doesn't come from the world. It comes from us. That's the idea behind racial constructivism. So this is going to be Mills's position, right? Racial constructivism. But there are still some other positions. But the remaining positions are anti-objectivist. That means that they think in no sense is race real, or there's no objective sense in which race is real. So subjectivism, for example, holds that race is more or less arbitrary, and therefore it's a sort of voluntary concept. That is, what race you are really just depends on what you think, what you say. So you can choose what race you are, and that's really all there is to it. Then there's relativism. This is similar to Mills's constructivism in that it says that race is defined by the standards of one's community, but the major difference here is that, like the subjectivist, the community can change its mind. Right? The community has within it the power to define its race. Both subjectivism and relativism are going to find criticism from Mills in that they seem to disregard the fact that race is very much baked into our social world in a way that doesn't allow us to change whenever we would like. Right? Other people, it seems, don't allow for race to have that limited form of reality. Finally, there's error theory. Error theory basically just says, look, race doesn't have biological reality, therefore it's just not real. It's not real. That's it. End of story. A lot of people aspire for that view to be the case, but Mills wants to argue that that's just not the way our particular social world is. We can't neglect the history within our social world. Doing so ignores the plight of all of the people who are subject to discrimination or worse because of this social category. Sure, it's not biologically real, but that doesn't mean it's not socially real. Okay, so he hopes that we're convinced now that constructivism about race is true. He thinks it fits the story best. We seem to be living in a vertical social system, but we can't ground that out by appealing to biology. So how are we supposed to figure it out? Well, it's got social reality. It has social reality. There's still a problem. The problem is this. Even if we decide Mills is right, constructivism about race is true, constructivism about race doesn't tell us how to neatly define racial categories. In fact, Mills is going to argue we don't really know how to do that, right? It's the case, sure, that race is real in the sense that it's intersubjectively agreed upon, but we have not agreed upon the limits of the concept, right? Where one race begins and the other ends, right? So, what is race then? Well, he thinks that there are a few different kinds of categories we use to try and divide races, but he's going to give us reasons to think that these don't do the job we expect them to do. So here's the possible categories for identifying racial categories, right? There's bodily appearance, how your phenotype expresses itself. Ancestry, self-awareness of ancestry, importantly different. Public awareness of ancestry, culture, experience, and self-identification. So none of these are going to be effective alone. And even in concert, Mills argues, they're not going to be enough for us to get the kind of understanding we would like to have about race, given the objective reality we're trying to ascribe to it. So let's look at his cases then. He gives us 10 or so different cases that each individually tried to point out that these categories don't sufficiently define the category of race in the way we need. So let's jump in. The first case has to do with conscious episodic passing. Episodic just meaning sometimes, right? So the idea here, in this case, is that this person is choosing to pass as another race some of the time, but not all of the time. Okay, so in this case, Mills wants us to imagine a person who has black ancestry and thinks of themselves as black, but is nevertheless capable of passing as white due to their appearance. Thus, when it suits them economically, socially, or whatever, they are willing to use their appearance to pass as a white person. Right? To this, Mills says, most of us are not going to say that this person is sometimes white and sometimes black. Right? He thinks the common response here is to say something like, this person is always black, and sometimes they simply pretend to be white. You might agree, but if you do, what falls out of that is that this criteria of appearance is clearly not all that's doing the work. If it was, then when this person passes, if they appear enough to be a white person in other people's eyes, that is what they would be. So appearance is not enough, right? Appearance is not going to be sufficient. Well, what about conscious permanent passing? So not just some of the time, but all of the time, right? So it's basically the exact same case, except for the fact that this person wants to pass as white all of the time. He gives a historical example from the literary critic Anatoly Broyard, who was only exposed to not be white after his death. And so he lived his life acting as though he were white, passing as though he were white, being accepted by the community as though he were white. And it was only discovered later, after his death, that he was in fact not, right? Mills says that in this kind of case, the person has changed their apparent race, but does that mean that they've changed their real race? Quote, once we accept a constructivist view of race, in what sense is this person still black? He looks white, socially categorized as white, embraces white culture, has white experiences. So why can't we say that he has successfully changed his race and become white? Well, he thinks largely most of us are going to say something like the ancestry is to blame, right? Sure, appearance, culture, all of this, they've changed, right? They are sufficiently white, whatever that means. But the ancestry can't be changed, right? Maybe that's what makes this person not a white person in this particular case, right? It's also possible, Mills argues, that we could say, well, there's a major difference in that a person who is naturally white would not have the same kind of anxiety about being found out, about being discovered, that the person who's doing conscious permanent passing would. And so maybe they aren't fully living the experience of a white person, right? They have this fear of being discovered. Okay, so in order to address that concern, Mills tweaks the case once again. Right, so now we have unconscious permanent passing. This time, the hypothetical person is not aware of their black ancestry. Indeed, they think that their ancestry is white. So to be clear, now we have someone who passes as white, identifies as white, believes themselves to only have white ancestry. What race are they? Here, Mills gives another historical example, Gregory Williams, who discovered only much later in his life that his father is black. He did not know beforehand. So the point of this case is that notion of being a pretender, that having that kind of anxiety that, oh, you might be discovered, we can dispense with that, right? That leaves us with this quandary. What race is this person? Quote, once an example is set up in which a racial classification is made wrongly, it is possible for us to see what our intuitions are really responding to. People focus on ancestry because in this world, ancestry and the other attributes usually go together. But separating them shows that ancestry is not really the important thing. What is important is the intersubjective/subjective criterion of what ancestry is thought to be. In other words, if you were to encounter this person in real life, you likely would ascribe them as being white. You would likely place them in the category of being white, right? It's only after you hear that, well, they have black ancestry that you might reconsider. But if that's the case, the ancestry part is not doing a lot of work when it comes to actual classifications. Right? When it comes to us making the classifications on the ground, so to speak. So it seems like, Mills is arguing, ancestry is not really doing all the work that we think it's doing. Right? We just tend to think that ancestry and appearance go hand in hand, but that's not always going to be the case. Okay, so Mills introduces more cases, clearly, right? In case 4, he brings up this idea of a man that he calls Mr. Oreo. So in this case, Mills asks us to imagine a man who cannot pass as white, but nevertheless identifies as white. He thinks that most of us are going to claim that Mr. Oreo is, quote, a black man pretending or trying and failing to be white. But why? Well, if realism about race is true, then the answer is easy. But because realism about race is not true, it's less clear. Quote, Mr. Oreo is still socially categorized as black. He will still experience racism, and so will still be black insofar as the experience of white racism is definitive of the black experience. When followed around in a department store, stopped by the police in a white neighborhood, or mistaken for the waiter in a restaurant, Mr. Oreo may protest with a reassuring laugh, "No, no, you don't understand. I'm not one of them." But his protest is not likely to be effective. Okay, so why do we think that Mr. Oreo is wrong about his assessment of what race he is? Well, it's because even though race is not biologically real, again, Mills is insisting it has social reality. The world around him is not going to permit this man from changing his race, right? Self-identification, in other words, is not everything. Self-identification is not everything. Okay, we can build on this case too, right? So now Mills wants us to consider a case in which the same person, the same man, has access to this technology which can totally transform his appearance to perfectly resemble another race. If this man undergoes such a treatment, has he changed his race? That's the question now. So if you initially think no, right, it's only sort of skin deep, Mills asks this. He has this challenge. Imagine there's a machine that could convert anyone into, quote, a massively muscled Superman capable of pressing hundreds of pounds. Right? So you walk in, no muscles whatsoever. You walk out, capable of bench pressing hundreds of pounds. Right? Would we say that that person just looks strong, or would we say they are actually strong? Maybe race works the same way, right? Clearly, you would say the person is actually strong. Just because they didn't put any work in, they just stepped into a machine, doesn't change the fact that they're actually strong now as a result of having gone through the machine. So maybe it works the same way with race. Sure, this man didn't always look this way, but he does now. So has he not changed his race? Mills further adds, there's really no significant morphological difference between people who are classified as white and people who are classified as black. So it's not like there's something about his body that prevents him from being more or less exactly like a white person once this outward appearance has been changed. Here's Mills. My suggestion is then that whether the apparent whiteness is natural or artificial should make no difference to its reality. In both cases, the person is apparently white. So the point of this exercise is to undermine conventional intuitions about the natural basis of whiteness and the location of its ontological depth in the biological. Race is ontologically deep, but its depth lies in intersubjectivity. A body that appears to intersubjective judgment to be white is all, I am arguing, that is necessary here. In other words, because in the eyes of society, this man would now be classified as white, that probably would be sufficient if Mills is right about constructivism, right? Because there is no base reality where race is concerned. There is no race in the world outside of our conceptions of it. This could be sufficient. Quote, a case can be made then that Mr. Oreo succeeds in changing his race, especially if he moves to a part of the country where nobody knows about his black past. Okay, so maybe it's possible then to change your race, which makes sense if it's the case that race is not an ontologically grounded, substantively grounded phenomena. His next case involves more kinds of unconscious passing, right? So, quote, this is someone with a genetically white body and all white ancestry who, unaware of his actual parentage, grows up as black, thinks of himself as black, is culturally black, and, importantly, is categorized by the community as black. Okay, so if ancestry is the main drive here, then we would have to conclude that this man is white, despite all of the experience that this man has had. Mills is clearly suggesting here we wouldn't do that. right? If this person grows up black, thinks of themselves as black, is culturally black, and all of the community identifies them as black, he thinks that's more or less what we're going to accept, right? To conclude that they're a white person simply because of their ancestry misses the fact that they have the lived experience of a black person. Okay, case 7. Here, Mills wants us to imagine, quote, a white renegade who sets out to support and identify with black struggles, steeps himself in black culture, joins non separatist black political organizations, and is therefore, on occasion, targeted for different treatment by hostile authorities. Mill says that most of us are going to say that this person is not really black, right? Largely, he thinks, because this person would have the option of changing their position, their affiliation whenever it suited them. So they don't have they are not living the black experience, right? They are not trapped within the sort of sphere of discrimination that the people that they are identifying with have forced upon them. So this is someone who is perhaps sympathetic, but is nevertheless still a white person. But, Mill says, we can consider the same case with 4 different possibilities. Each of these is going to change, potentially, how we think of the person. Potentiality 1. He actually does have some black ancestry, though nobody knows it. Does that change your opinion about this white renegade who supports black causes, identifies with black culture, etc., etc.? Well, if you think that ancestry counts for a lot, it probably should. But the thing is most likely, at least Mills thinks, we're not going to accept that, right? Culturally, we're still going to say, without knowledge of this, we don't have knowledge of the ancestry, that this is still a white person. So again, ancestry doesn't seem to be doing the job. Second potentiality. He discovers that he has black ancestry and makes it known publicly, and then, as a result, is categorized as black. Well, if that were to happen, and the community's ideas were updated, like our overall social community, if our ideas about this person were updated, then I think it is likely we would consider this man to be black rather than white, right? Third potentiality, it's about to get weirder. He discovers his black ancestry, but keeps it secret because he wants to earn his blackness through his own efforts. Thus, he remains officially categorized as white. Complicated. So now, not only is there ancestry involved, which matters for some, he is aware of it. There is some awareness of the ancestry. Nevertheless, the public is not made aware of it, and therefore the social categorization doesn't change. Maybe that changes things, maybe not. Lastly, the same as the second option, right? So this white renegade discovers that he has black ancestry, makes it known publicly, and society at large agrees, okay, you're actually black. But this time, that discovered black ancestry is actually an error that no one ever discovers to be an error. Well, society at large is now categorizing him as a black man. He identifies as being black. He thinks he has black ancestry. Everyone agrees. Is it not true? Because the ancestry is actually an error? It's difficult to say. It's very difficult to say. In fact, that's where Mills is trying to lead us. It's going to be incredibly difficult to say. Why? Well, because race doesn't have this kind of objective reality built into the world. It's this kind of social categorization that has reality, but it has reality because we make it so. And we haven't made it so very cleanly. Okay, so what about the position then of no race? There are some that argue that because of the lack of that reality, the concept of race, because it's allowed for so much harm to occur in the world, should just be abandoned, right? We should just refuse to accept identifications of race and get rid of the idea altogether. Mill says this position seems to be a non-starter because it ignores the fact that in a racialized society, people will continue to have racialized experiences, whether they acknowledge themselves as raced or not. In other words, just because there's no objective basis, and by that I mean in the world, for race, does not mean we can act like there is no objective basis at all. In fact, we ignore the sort of intersubjectivity that creates objectivity of race at our own peril. Why? Because our society has constructed racialized experiences out of these racial categories. So it's going to be important for things like moral considerations. We can't simply ignore it. It exists. It exists in our history and it exists in our present. So it cannot be ignored. So summing up, realism about race, Mills argues, is almost certainly false. However, because it plays such a large role in how our society functions, we cannot simply ignore it. So, race is objective. It does have some kind of objective reality. But it's only objective in the sense that we think of the concept as objective. Thus, racial categories are defined intersubjectively, right? As a group, we seem to have come together and given these categories importance. Okay. How we actually make assessments of racial categories is not perfect because these things have been constructed. But that doesn't mean we can throw it away, right? We're sort of stuck with this thing that we can't really understand because we've constructed it. But it's nevertheless important to acknowledge its existence. Okay, so next, we're going to talk about gender, right? We're reading from Elizabeth Barnes here, The Metaphysics of Gender. Her project is very similar. She wants to understand what the nature of gender is, and she's going to begin by exploring the possibility that it might be biological. Right? Ultimately, of course, she's going to conclude, no, it's not the case, and that's going to lead her much in the same direction as Mills in regard to race. So she's interested then in what it means to say that someone is one gender versus any other. She thinks it's pretty clear that it has to be more than just biological sex. Why? Well, biological sex, she argues, does not neatly divide into the kind of male-female binary that a lot of people would suggest, right? And thus, it's not going to provide the kind of support we need to ground out some kind of binary gender distinction. Because intersex bodies exist, it's possible for someone to have all of the external physical characteristics that we typically identify as female, for instance, to be treated by society as a woman because of that, and to think of themselves as a woman, and yet still have XY chromosomes. So it seems like this kind of biological view is not really going to do everything we need in order to ground out gender identity. Okay, more on biology. What is clear is that society is making assumptions about us based on our outward physical appearance. Quote, maybe people will think that you're likely to be nurturing, or likely to talk a lot, or likely to be emotional, or likely to be particularly good at organizing, but not that great at abstract reasoning and innovation, and so forth. The particular assumptions can vary a lot from place to place and time to time. The main point is just that people's perceptions of your sex characteristics are deeply socially significant, in a way that people's perceptions of your eye color or shoe size are not. Okay, so biological differences don't seem to be responsible for differences between gender. Nevertheless, Barnes is arguing, there are these perceived differences based on your outward appearance that society is clumping together with particular traits. Thus, we can't say that biology is completely removed from gender. While it's not the case that gender can be found in biology, Barnes is arguing, it is nevertheless connected in the sense that it is because of certain kind of signs biologically that people are typically going to ascribe one particular gender over the other, right? Okay, these perceived differences change over time and from place to place, though average anatomical differences between males and females remains fairly stable. So once again, biology is not going to do the full role that we need. Gender norms seem to be fluctuating, right? Quote, during the 18th and early 19th century, the greatest heights of emotionality were thought to be the preserve of men. Women, it was thought, weren't capable of the same depths of feeling as men, to the extent that the declaration that, quote, women feel just as much as men feel in the novel Jane Eyre was considered genuinely shocking. Right? So a sort of reversal of current gender norms, perhaps. A biological notion of gender is also not going to help us understand trans and non-binary folks. Right? Barnes notes that a biological notion of gender cannot be used to deny these people their identities because we have no stable notion of gender based on biology to begin with. Okay, so biology is not going to do the story. Biology is not going to do the work that the story requires, right? So what should we do? Well, social construction rears its head one more time, right? If gender is not determined by biology, then what is it? Well, Barnes thinks it could be just another form of social norm. We have a lot of social norms. There's norms for being fashionable, being cool, things like that. But, she argues, gender is somewhat stickier than those kinds of norms. Even though some cultures over time have had additional gender descriptors beyond just the binary between man and woman, the division between man and woman, those two being present, she argues, seems to be more or less universal. It also seems to be universal amongst cultures that division is made by associating some kinds of behaviors or traits with bodies that we typically regard as female or male. So not only is it the case that man and woman in terms of gender divide seems to exist throughout all of these different cultures, they also seem to be picked out based on certain kinds of bodily appearances, right? So it's going to be more than just a norm like what it is to be cool, right? It's much stickier than that. It seems to be sticking around. Lastly, this social norm differs in that it is almost always facilitated, or facilitates rather, a kind of systematic oppression of those that are identified as women. Okay, so for this reason, some philosophers think that it's a special kind of social norm. It is a social norm, but it's a special kind. One that's not rooted in biology, but is nevertheless very deeply socially entrenched. Race could also fit here. I think Mills would be happy to say the same about race. Because of this, it might not be strictly up to you what gender you belong to, much like we saw with Mills when he rejected subjectivism. The social constructivist about gender is going to say it might not be entirely up to you. That view we call gender externalism. Gender internalism is the opposite of that, right? It says that what gender you are is determined by an internal fact, right? It's dependent on what you feel to be the case. So we're going to look at these two different options now. First up, social constructivism, gender externalism, right, by another name. So gender externalists think that women have some feature in common that grants them that status, right? Some kind of feature that those of us who are not them can identify them with, right? By and large, most gender externalists think that that common feature is something like the social experience of sex-based oppression. That is, the experience of oppression because of one's externally perceived sex that grants someone the gender status of woman. So, what is it to be a woman for most gender externalists? It's to be assigned this particular role that leads to oppression because of your perceived sex, right? So, when selecting this common feature, externalist, Barnes says, has to be very careful here. Because of intersectionality, which just has to do with the fact that we all, as individuals, belong to many different social categories, right? You are not only gendered, but you are raced, you are classed, right? There are many different social categories that change how the world experiences you and you experience the world from individual to individual, right? So if you're a gender externalist and looking for the thing that makes all women women, you need to make sure that it holds true across all of these different intersectional statuses, right? So here, Barnes uses the philosopher Sally Haslinger as an example of a gender externalist so that we can see what this might look like, right? Haslinger argues that in order to be a woman, you must fulfill three different characteristics, right? There are three different things that have to be true of you. First, you have to be observed, for the most part, as having the sexual characteristics indicative of a female's biological role in reproduction. In other words, you need to appear, by society's standards, to have a female body, right? To have these particular kinds of sexual characteristics. Two, you need to be in a position that kind of those perceived characteristics are thought by your society to put you in a subordinate position. And finally, those two facts together contribute to your oppression or subordination. Those are the things that make a woman as far as Haslinger is concerned. All women will have that in common under her view. So for Haslinger, quote, gender is just this system that disadvantages people based on perceptions of female sex and a female's role in reproduction. Now, Barnes says there's a lot of problem here, right? It's a decent attempt at finding something that joins all women together, but there are also some concerns, right? She's concerned here primarily that externalism puts too much weight on other people's opinions. Because of this, it would be the case, for instance, that if you're the kind of person that people are largely confused with where your gender presentation is concerned, Haslinger's view seems to suggest that you would not be a woman. And Barnes thinks that this is clearly wrong, right? Because, she argues, there are masculine appearing or presenting women. They exist. Society's being confused about them does not mean that they should no longer count as women. Further, Barnes argues, it would mean that something like a society of strong women who don't face oppression would not count as women, which is also bizarre, right? Here, Barnes talks about the Amazons, right? The Amazons supposed to be this society of incredibly powerful women, practically no men within their society, so there's no oppression, there's no patriarchal oppression within their society. By Haslinger's view, they could not count as women, right? Which seems bizarre. Okay, so given all these concerns, why not try out gender internalism? Gender internalists think that gender is determined by self-identity. That is, if you identify as a woman, for a gender internalist, you are one, right? That's all that it takes. The same is true for men, gender queer folks, non-binary folks, etc. If you identify as that, that's what you are. Barnes clarifies, quote, for the most part, when philosophers talk about gender identity, they mean your internally felt sense of your relationship to the gender norms and categories that are common within our society. Okay, So it's this internal felt sense of being related to those norms. This is important. Why? Because Barnes wants to clarify that thinking that it's appropriate to identify you with this gender norm, does not mean that you think the gender norm is somehow not harmful, right? So you can think, for example, it's appropriate for people to think of me as a woman, right? And thus I identify with that notion while still thinking that there are harmful social norms where being gendered as a woman is concerned, right? You don't have to agree with the gender norms to think that it's appropriate for you to be labeled in that way. Okay, so for gender internalism, you don't have to tell this complicated story about what unites all of these people who identify as these genders. It's just down to self identification, right? Easy. But there's some concerns with this too, right? So internalism avoids those problems of externalism where misgendering seemed to be on the table. But in exchange, it makes gender a kind of private phenomena, a thing that only you really know. Because of this, Barnes argues, it's not going to be possible for us to know if your felt association with this particular gender identity is the same felt association that someone else has with that gender identity. Right? We might both report that we identify as men or we identify as women, right? Because it's a private phenomena, my feeling might be totally different from yours. And if that's the case, we might not be talking about the same thing at all, right? We might not be talking about the same thing at all. And if that's the case, then it seems like we don't have a unified view of what it means to be a woman, right? So in trading away this potentially problematic theory of externalism in order to prevent misgendering, we might be giving up on any robust notion of gender, right? We might be giving up on the possibility of unifying what it means to belong to one gender versus another. Lastly, she thinks that internalism doesn't get rid of all cases of misgendering. So here she has in mind a case where you could have a significantly cognitively disabled woman who isn't, at least for the moment, capable of having feelings or experiences that are aligned with any one gender or the other. So they're not capable of having this felt affiliation to any particular gender. Because of that, by the lights of gender internalism, it would not be appropriate to call them a woman. They haven't identified with being a woman. But Barnes says this doesn't quite work because, based on their appearance, the societal perception of their bodies, they could still face gendered oppression. They could still be treated like a woman by society and face all of the oppression that comes along with that. And therefore, it seems like gender internalism, by mislabeling them as not woman, misses something important. So, Barnes's conclusion: much like the project of understanding race, the project of understanding gender is incredibly difficult, right? In both cases, race and gender, there doesn't seem to be room for us to say that there's grounds for some kind of robust metaphysical existence, right? There's no biological grounding of these things. Nevertheless, it seems true that these concepts, both of them, are greatly socially entrenched and thus, in some respect, are very real, at least where our social worlds are concerned. So while we know it's important to understand these concepts, given how entrenched they are socially, how much work they're playing, their lack of any objective basis in physical reality makes them less stable than other norms. It makes it very difficult for us to assign them accurately because there's no robust metaphysical existence, right? So Barnes concludes there. She doesn't know. She doesn't know what it means to be this gender or that. There are a variety of options, but both, the ones she considers at least, seem to have problems. Not a very satisfying conclusion. We would like to have an answer, right? Um, but at least we're left with a better understanding of the questions. Hopefully you found that interesting. That's it for this time. So stay healthy, stay safe.